Every army in the Second World War could be identified by ear. A machine gun tells you which side of the field you are on. The German MG-42 fired so fast that the individual shots stopped being individual shots. Men described it as fabric tearing, but the sound that mattered most was not a machine gun. It was one man with a rifle, and it was mostly silence. A bolt-action rifle has a rhythm, and the rhythm is a pause. The shooter fires, then he breaks his cheek from the stock, lifts the bolt handle, draws it back, pushes it forward, turns it down, and settles his face again. On a range, a well-trained man could manage about 15 aimed rounds a minute. In a wet hole in December, with cold hands and a heartbeat in his throat, he managed far fewer. Every army carrying a bolt action built its tactics around that pause, because the pause was unavoidable. It was in the manuals, in the doctrine, and in the design of the war. Then a German infantryman would come up against an American position, and the pause would not be there. Not once, not 8 times. The rifle across the field kept firing, and when it stopped, another nearby had already started. No rhythm to read, no window to move in, no arithmetic to work with. In the accounts German veterans gave afterward, the same impression comes back in different words. The American rifle did not stop. An honest audit has to say something uncomfortable about that phrase at the outset. Nobody can produce a Wehrmacht document in which German infantry give the American rifle a nickname. It belongs to memory, and memory is not an archive. What the archives do contain is a filing card. The German Army Weapons Office published identification sheets for captured foreign equipment, and in that catalogue the American rifle has a German name, Selbstladegewehr 251A. A number in a recognition manual, so a German soldier could name the thing shooting at him. That is the whole of it. So the question this video can answer is not whether a German infantryman said those words. It is why he would have. And that is where this becomes strange, because the German army was not slow, not stupid, and not short of talent. Germany in the 1930s held the deepest reserve of firearms engineering on the planet: Mauser, Walther, Haenel. The bolt action that armed Germany was the same basic action that armed most of the world, including the United States, whose own M1 903 Springfield copied it so closely that the American government agreed to pay Mauser 75 cents for every rifle it built, to a ceiling of $200,000. Germany had been the teacher, and America had the receipts. The Germans knew about the American self-loading rifle. They began their own program before the war started, on their own initiative. They tried 3 separate times across 7 years. They captured American rifles in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes by the tens of thousands. They never closed the gap. Not once. Not for a single month of the war. The explanations offered over the years all sound reasonable and all fall apart under weight. It was the clip, people say, or the sound the clip made. It was raw materials. It was Hitler interfering. Each contains something true. None explains why the best small arms industry in the world, given 7 years and a clear look at the problem, produced an answer that came too late and in numbers too small to matter. Because the answer was never sitting in the rifle. The answer is a decision made in a Washington office in 1932 by a general who is usually blamed for it. It is a machinist from a Quebec farm who left school at 11 and never earned $1 in royalties from the most produced military rifle in American history. It is a foreman whose name appears in the record once, an 80-round cartridge belt, and a factory in Massachusetts that had been making guns since before there was a constitution to defend. Tonight we run the audit on the rifle that would not stop, and on why the men facing it could hear the answer perfectly well and never understand what they were listening to. To find it, we start in a textile mill in Connecticut, with a boy sweeping floors to learn English. Here is the problem every general staff in the world was staring at after 1918. The First World War had produced a brutal statistic. The rifle, the weapon that had defined infantry for 3 centuries, was not doing the killing anymore. Artillery was. Machine guns were doing much of the rest. The individual rifleman was contributing a share of the casualties so small that it forced one conclusion on anyone willing to follow the numbers. The rifleman is no longer the point. He is the support. Germany followed that logic further than anyone else and built a squad around it that was, on its own terms, close to perfect. The German Gruppe began the war at 10 men and did not contain 10 fighters. It contained 1 weapon and 9 men serving it. At the center sat the general-purpose machine gun, first the MG-34, then the faster and cheaper MG-42. The gunner fired it, the assistant fed it and changed the barrel when it cooked. The rest carried ammunition, protected its flanks, and provided just enough rifle fire to let it move. From October 1943, the establishment dropped to 9, and the post they deleted was the dedicated ammunition carrier, which tells you where the squad's center of gravity had always been. The German rifleman carried the carabiner, 98K bolt action, 5 rounds from a stripper clip. An excellent rifle, accurate, robust, beautifully made, and completely secondary. It was not supposed to win the firefight. The machine gun was supposed to win the firefight. Say the paradox out loud. Germany solved the problem of infantry firepower by concluding that most infantry did not need very much of it. That was not laziness. It was efficient, cheap, proven, and for the first 3 years of the war it worked spectacularly because all the firepower sat in one pair of hands. The Americans, almost by accident, went the other way. And the reason had less to do with vision than with a farm, a mill, and a man who could not stop taking things apart. Jean Cantius Garand was born on January 1, 1888, on a farm near Saint-Rémy, Quebec, one of 12 children. His mother died when he was 11. The family moved south to Jewett City, Connecticut, and the children went into a textile mill, where the boy, later known as John, swept floors and picked up English while he did it. That is roughly where his schooling ended. He became a machinist, then worked in a tool factory in Providence. The family lived near a gun club range, and shooters left their rifles at the Garand house between matches, which meant a boy with a machinist's hands had constant access to other people's firearms. In November 1919, he was hired by Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the government arsenal producing arms for the United States since 1794. He stayed 34 years, and for roughly 15 of them he chased one question nobody in authority was eager to hear. Why should a soldier do with his hands what the burning powder could do for him? Every shot generates a violent surplus of gas, free, in the barrel, several times a second. Every bolt-action rifle in the world wasted it and asked a frightened man to make up the difference with his arm. The army was interested in principle. The trouble was that everybody else was too. The most serious rival was John Pedersen, a designer of international reputation, and Pedersen had a broader idea than a rifle. He had a cartridge. The .276 Pedersen was smaller, lighter, and lower pressure than the American standard. Less recoil meant faster follow-up shots, less weight meant a man carried more of them, and a smaller cartridge puts far less strain on the moving parts of a self-loading action. Garand, being nobody's fool, developed his rifle in the smaller caliber as well, and through the trials of 1928 to 1931, his design kept winning. Pedersen's action required cartridges coated in lubricant. Garand's did not. In January 1932, the Semi-Automatic Rifle Board recommended adoption of the Garand rifle in the .276 caliber, at which point the Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, stepped in and cancelled the cartridge. MacArthur's objection was not technical. He argued that changing the standard rifle cartridge would introduce chaos, confusion, and uncertainty into the supply system, and that war conditions would multiply that confusion until it outweighed any advantage a self-loading rifle could offer. On February 25, 1932, the order came down from the Adjutant General. All work on the .276 was to cease immediately. Everything was to be redirected to the existing 30 caliber cartridge, the 30-06, which the Army already had in enormous quantity. That decision is remembered almost universally as the great American mistake of the interwar years, and every serious history of the rifle pauses to mourn the .276. Here is where this audit parts company with the consensus. MacArthur's decision was also the single reason the rifle ever reached 4 million men. Consider what keeping the old cartridge preserved. Every round already in American depots stayed useful. Every machine gun kept firing the same round as every rifle. Every gauge and loading line built up since 1906 stayed where it was. The new rifle became an addition to a system, rather than the demolition of one. A smaller cartridge would have produced a better weapon and far fewer of them, later, at a price Congress in the Depression would very likely have refused. Garand had been working on the .30 caliber version all along. Pedersen could not convert, and his design fell away. On August 3, 1933, the rifle was designated Semi-Automatic Rifle, caliber .30, M1. Trials in May 1934 turned up a long list of faults. 2 more years of correction followed. It was cleared for procurement on November 7, 1935, and standardized on January 9, 1936, as United States Rifle, caliber .30, M1. Now look at the thing itself, because in 1936 it was not obviously a war winner. It weighed 9 pounds 8 ounces. The carabiner 98K weighed a little over 8, so the American was carrying an extra pound and a quarter before he loaded it. It was 43.5 inches long, gas-operated, with a rotating bolt. It held 8 rounds in a stamped steel clip that was loaded into the top of the receiver as a single unit and stayed inside the rifle until the last round was fired. It had no detachable magazine, which sounds like an oversight and was not. The board had worried that a large opening in the receiver bottom would admit dirt, and dirt was what killed self-loading rifles in the 1920s. The consequence, which irritated soldiers for 20 years, was that a partly empty rifle could not be conveniently topped up. You committed to 8 rounds, and the number that mattered. The official aimed rate of fire for the M1 was about 24 rounds a minute. For a trained bolt-action rifleman, it was around 15, and 15 was the optimistic figure. That is not a revolution on paper. It is a heavier, costlier, more complicated rifle that fires perhaps 60% more aimed shots per minute than the thing it replaced. The first machine-made production rifle was proof-fired and tested for accuracy on July 21, 1937. Deliveries began that September at 10 rifles per day. By March 1938 it was 20. By July 1939, 80. At that pace, arming the United States Army would take somewhere north of a century. And then, before it could ever be fired at an enemy, the rifle nearly died in public. Within 3 years of its adoption, it was jamming in front of witnesses. A national magazine had set out to destroy its reputation. Congress was threatening its funding, and a Marine Corps Reserve captain came within one Senate committee of replacing it by act of law. The first crisis was a jam, and it had a name, because it was so consistent that men could set a watch by it. They called it the 7th round stoppage. The 8-round clip holds its cartridges in 2 staggered columns, and depending on how the clip was loaded by hand at the arsenal, the top cartridge could sit on the right or on the left. When the top round sat on the right, the 7th round would frequently jump out of alignment as it came up and drive its nose into the top of the receiver. The rifle stopped dead, 1 round from empty, with a live cartridge wedged in the works. This was not a flaw in Garand's drawings. To make the rifle producible in quantity, the tooling had been adjusted, and one small internal surface in the receiver was being slightly sheared away during machining. Garand had not been consulted when the manufacturing methods were planned. The armory had taken the inventor's design and industrialized it without asking the inventor. The problem surfaced at the worst possible moment. At the 1939 national matches at Camp Perry, the Army intended to demonstrate the new rifle to the American shooting public, which is to say the most opinionated audience available. James Hatcher of the Ordnance Department applied a field expedient. He modified the followers on the 200 match rifles so they would accept only clips loaded with the top round on the left, and ordered every clip issued at Camp Perry loaded that way. The demonstration went perfectly. Nobody watching had any idea. The real cure came from a man almost nobody has heard of. Walter Campbell, an assistant foreman at Springfield Armory, worked out that a partly emptied clip held its remaining cartridges less firmly and modified the rear lever of the operating catch to press them slightly to one side. An ordnance engineer confirmed it by test, and somebody then picked up an unfinished receiver lying around the shop and spotted the sheared surface behind the whole thing. The tooling was recalibrated and the problem vanished. We know that sequence at all because Julian Hatcher, brother of the officer at Camp Perry, wrote it down afterward in his book on the rifle. The second crisis was more serious, because it was a design failure rather than a production one. Garand's original gas system was a gas trap. Rather than drilling a hole in the barrel, it captured expanding gas at the muzzle inside a cap and redirected it back into a piston. It had one great supposed virtue. It left the barrel untouched, and the prevailing belief among ordnance men in several countries was that drilling a hole in a rifle barrel would erode the bore and destroy accuracy. In practice, the gas trap fouled with carbon, loosened, and was awkward to manufacture. In October 1939, the Ordnance Department adopted a straightforward gas port instead, a hole drilled in the barrel. The redesigned front end reached troops the following spring. The barrel grew from 22 inches to 24, and overall length stayed about the same because the false muzzle was gone. From that point, the basic mechanism went untouched for 16 years. Hold that October 1939 date in your head. When we get to the German side of this story, it is going to matter more than anything else in the script. The third crisis was political, and it very nearly worked. Melvin Johnson was a Harvard law graduate and a captain in the Marine Corps Reserve who had been assigned to observe the rifle testing at Springfield. Having watched Garand and Pedersen compete, he concluded he could do better and designed his own recoil-operated rifle with a 10-round rotary magazine and a barrel that came off in seconds. He received his first patent in September 1937. Army Ordnance tested it at Aberdeen from December 1939. Over 6,000 rounds went through it with only 12 minor stoppages, a genuinely good result. The report of February 23, 1940 rejected it anyway. Too long, too heavy, unreliable with a bayonet fitted, and a magazine judged delicate and prone to admitting sand. Johnson did not accept that. He had family political connections and used them, and on May 29, 1940, the Senate Committee on Military Affairs convened to consider a bill making the Johnson rifle a standard arm of the United States military. Look at that date. On the day the Senate sat down to argue about which self-loading rifle to buy, the British Expeditionary Force was being lifted off the beaches at Dunkirk. The urgency in that room was not theoretical. The Marine Corps ran its own comparison at Quantico that same month, and the Johnson outshot the Garand. Captain George Van Orden's summary judged it materially superior in accuracy and potential combat efficiency. That is a serving Marine officer telling his own service that the Army had picked the wrong rifle. Then came 4 weeks of trials at San Diego in November 1940, and this was the real test. 4 rifles went in, the M1 903 Springfield as a control, the Johnson, a Winchester prototype that would evolve into the M1 carbine, and the Garand, now carrying the gas port system that had been in production for 5 months. The Garand won. Narrowly, but it won. Sitting on that 6-member Marine board was a colonel named Merritt Edson, and remember him, because he is going to walk into this story again in the worst possible circumstances. The Marines declined the Johnson, and the deciding factor was not elegance. It was that the Garand was already in production, and spare parts could be drawn from Army ordnance depots anywhere in the world. That is the hinge of the entire audit. The rifle did not survive because it was the best rifle. It survived because it was already being made, and because everything around it already existed. Which brings us to the part the Germans never saw, because it was not on the battlefield at all. John Garand did not only design a rifle, he designed the means of making it, and this is the least celebrated and most decisive thing he ever did. The evidence sits in an odd place. Years later, when the question of compensating him reached Washington, the Ordnance Department assembled a file of what he had actually contributed, and most of it is not about the rifle, it is about machines that make rifles. One entry concerns threading the barrel for the gas cylinder. The standard method used an expensive grinder cutting threads concentric with the bore, at roughly 50 barrels an hour, and it turned out they needed to be concentric with the outside of the muzzle instead. Garand built a small machine that chased the thread correctly at well over twice the rate. The file goes on like that. For all of it, he drew a civil service salary. In January 1936, he transferred every right he held in his inventions to the United States government. He never received a royalty, not one. Now assemble the machine, because the rifle is only the visible piece. Start with the rifle. Add the cartridge belt, 10 pockets, 1 8-round clip in each, 80 rounds riding on a man's hips where he can reach them without looking. Add cloth bandoliers, 6 clips each. handed out by the armful before an attack. Add a squad of 12 in which the riflemen are the point of the formation, supported by a Browning automatic rifle rather than built around it. Add a training establishment that could turn a farm boy into a competent shot, and an ammunition industry that could feed all of it indefinitely. Now run the arithmetic no German staff officer quite ran. A German squad, 9 or 10 men depending on the year, generates a torrent of fire from one point and a thin trickle from the bolt actions around it. An American squad of 12 generates a continuous, distributed, unpredictable volume from a dozen separate places at once, and it can sustain that because 80 rounds are already on each man's body. The difference is not that the American rifle beat the German machine gun. It never did. The difference is what it did to the machine gun's situation. Once the enemy's riflemen fired continuously from everywhere, the German gun became the only object worth concentrating on, and it was also the loudest, the most visible, the slowest to move, and the one thing whose loss ended the squad's ability to fight. The American answer did not outshoot the MG-42. It made the MG-42 lonely. In January 1940, Springfield was making 100 rifles a day. By January 1942, it was making 1,103 a day. Production peaked in January 1944, with 122,001 rifles completed in 31 days. That works out to 3,936 rifles a day, or 164 every hour, around the clock, for a month. On January 26, 1945, on Third Army letterhead, George Patton wrote to the Chief of Ordnance and opened with a line that has followed the rifle ever since. In his opinion, he said, the M1 was the greatest battle implement ever devised. Almost nobody quotes the rest of that letter. Patton went on to praise the machine guns, the mortars, the artillery, and the tanks in nearly the same terms. He was thanking the men who supplied him. That does not make the line untrue. It does mean the rifle was being praised as part of a system by a man who knew he was fighting with one. Springfield produced 3,526,922 M1 rifles. Winchester, the only private contractor building them during the war, delivered 513,880. The combined wartime total is 4,040,802. One small request, because it costs nothing and it decides whether this channel keeps existing. Walter Campbell has no monument and no biography. If you think men like that belong in front of more people, the like button is the entire mechanism by which that happens. It is a small thing. So was the part he fixed. Now the test, which happened twice. Once in the absence of the rifle, once in its presence, and the contrast is the cleanest evidence in this case. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal with the M1 903 Springfield as its standard rifle, bolt action, 5 rounds. This was not a corps that had ignored the new weapon. Marine interest in a self-loader goes back to 1932, and the Corps ordered its first Garands in 1936. It had judged the rifle best of the self-loaders at San Diego 21 months before the landing. It simply had not made the switch, partly for supply reasons and partly because many Marine officers believed a bolt action in trained hands was the better weapon. In September, on a ridge south of Henderson Field, Colonel Merritt Edson, the same officer from that San Diego board, held the most important ground in the South Pacific for 3 days and nights, with men carrying bolt actions. They held, and it cost them terribly. Then, on October 13th, the Army's 164th Infantry came ashore on the same island. National Guardsmen from North Dakota. They carried M1 rifles. Marine accounts of what followed are consistent and almost uniformly cheerful. Marines traded for those rifles. They swapped captured souvenirs, sidearms, food and anything else that would move, and acquired Garands by every method short of open theft, and possibly not always short of it. Nobody had to write a doctrinal paper. Men who had been shot at with bolt actions, alongside men with self-loaders, worked it out in weeks. The Corps adopted the M1 over the following year. That is the control experiment. Now the crucible. December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes. The Lochim Gap, a corridor of low hills and poor roads the German army had used to enter Belgium twice before. and that the Allied line now treated as a quiet sector fit for green divisions and exhausted ones. Holding the right flank of the 99th Infantry Division was its intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 394th Infantry Regiment, 18 men. Their job was not to fight. It was to watch, patrol, and report. They had been chosen as expert marksmen in exceptional condition, and several were former students of the Army Specialized Training Program, a scheme that sent bright soldiers to university and was abruptly cancelled, dumping college men into rifle companies. Their commander was First Lieutenant Lyle Book Jr., 20 years old, one of the youngest officers in the United States Army and the second youngest man in his own platoon. He had lied about his age to enlist at 14 and had been in uniform for 6 years by the time he reached Belgium. They were dug in on a wooded rise above the village of Lanzerath, above a road running west through the gap. The holes had been prepared over weeks, deepened, roofed with logs and earth, sited to cover a bare slope. There was nothing else to do in a quiet sector but dig, so they had dug. With them were 4 more men, a forward observation team from Battery C of the 371st Field Artillery Battalion, 22 Americans. Before dawn, German artillery opened along the divisional front and hammered their position for close to 2 hours. Communications to regiment went down and stayed down, and the artillery observers lost contact with their guns. Whatever happened next, no shells were coming. Then the fog lifted and Bock's men watched a column of German paratroopers come up the road below them. This was the 1st Battalion of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, roughly 500 men, reinforced by about 50 more from the 27th Fusilier Regiment. They were moving in daylight, on a road, in column, in the open, because they had been told the sector was held by nothing worth worrying about. What follows is the plainest possible demonstration of the thing this video is about, and there is nothing clever in it. 18 riflemen in prepared holes on high ground, a machine gun, a bare slope, and an enemy who has to come up it. The Germans attacked frontally, 3 times, up that slope. Each time they came into a volume of aimed rifle fire arriving from a dozen positions at once, continuously, with no rhythm to shelter in. An attacker crossing open ground reads enemy strength by the fire he is receiving, because he cannot see the holes. He counts rifles by ear. Against 18 men with self-loading rifles firing steadily from good cover, the count he arrives at is not 18. It is a company. The German commander behaved exactly as a man would who believed he was facing a company. He kept attacking the front and did not send a strong force wide around the flank for hours. Hours were the only currency that mattered that day. German losses on that slope are recorded at roughly 90 to 100 men, killed, wounded and missing. I will be straight with you. Some popular accounts put the number several times higher, and nothing in the record settles it. What is not in dispute is that the attack was stopped, repeatedly, by 22 men who were not supposed to be fighting at all. Inside the American holes, the arithmetic ran the other way. Every man had 80 rounds on his belt, and whatever bandoliers he could carry. The rate of fire that made the position look like a company was also the rate at which it consumed itself. No resupply, no radio, no artillery, only what each man had brought, and the daylight which was running out. They knew exactly what the trade was. They had orders to hold, no communications with which to ask for a change of those orders, and no authority to leave. So they held, and watched the bandoliers get lighter, and made their shots count the way men do when they have counted their remaining rounds and know the number. At dusk, with the platoon almost dry, German infantry worked around the flank and into the tree line behind them, and it ended. 1 American had been killed. 21 were captured, 14 of them wounded. Private William Sakanicus had been hit in the face. The Germans carried the American wounded down to a cafe in Lanzerath, being used as an aid station, and treated them. Bauck, wounded himself, sat propped against a wall in that cellar and watched a clock on the far side of the room come around to midnight. It was now December 17th. He was 21 years old. Here is why this ridge belongs in an audit rather than a highlight reel. Waiting behind that stalled column on the same road was Kampfgruppe Piper, the armoured spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army and the most important formation of the entire German offensive. Piper's plan depended on speed through the Loschem Gap in the first hours, and he lost most of the first day. Be careful here. because this is where popular accounts overreach. That ridge was not the only thing holding paper up. 2 railway overpasses at Loschheim had been blown, an old German minefield cost him around 10 vehicles, and the roads behind him were choked with traffic. The official American history treats Lanzerath as one cause among several. What is not in dispute is that the infantry meant to clear his road spent the daylight hours failing to take a rise held by 18 men, and that Bauch's citation credits the platoon with an 18-hour delay. Piper's timetable never recovered, and neither did the offensive. Put yourself honestly on the German side of that slope, because those are the men in our title. You came up 3 times. Each time the fire came from everywhere and never paused, and you never saw a single position clearly enough to name it. You reported a strong locality held in company strength, because that is what your ears and your casualties told you, and your report was entirely rational and entirely wrong. You spent a day of the last offensive Germany would ever mount on a hill held by 22 men who were not even infantry. They did not outfight you. There were 18 of them. They outfired you, and the reason they could is that each of them was carrying a rifle that turned every trigger pull into a shot instead of turning every shot into a chaw, and 80 rounds to feed it with. So we arrive at the question the German army had been asking for 4 years. Why could they not simply build the same thing? They tried, harder and earlier than the popular story admits, and the way they failed is the most instructive part of this case. Start by killing the first myth, which is that Germany only woke up to self-loading rifles after meeting the Americans. Walther and Mauser were working with the German government on self-loading designs as early as 1938, and both submitted rifles for testing that year. The designation Gewehr 41 was chosen because the army expected the weapon finished and in mass production by 1941. Germany was not slow to want the capability. Germany was slow to accept what the capability costs. Look at the 2 specifications the German army wrote into the requirement, because they are the fingerprints of an institution that did not believe its own idea. No holes were to be drilled in the barrel, because a gas port would supposedly erode the bore and ruin accuracy, and the rifle had to carry a manual bolt handle as a backup, so a soldier could work it by hand if the self-loading action failed. Read those again as statements of belief rather than engineering. The first says accuracy matters more than reliability. The second says, we assume this will break. Both requirements forced Walther and Mauser down the same road. With no port allowed, gas had to be captured at the muzzle, in a cone-shaped trap that deflected it back into a long-stroke piston. That is a gas trap. It is precisely the architecture Springfield Armory had already built, tested, suffered with, and formally abandoned in October 1939. Germany walked into the exact dead end the Americans had just walked out of, roughly 2 years later, and did so because it had written that dead end into the requirement before a single prototype was built. Both German rifles fouled at the muzzle as cooling gas deposited carbon. Both were muzzle-heavy and temperamental. The results are in the numbers. Mauser's version was a failure. 6,673 were built, of which 1,673 came back as unusable. Production stopped. Walther's version was better and still not good. Figures are disputed, from about 40,000 to 145,000, and it suffered a savage attrition rate on the Eastern Front. It was expensive and slow to reload, being fed by clips into a fixed magazine. And here is a detail that should be uncomfortable for anyone telling this as a simple American story. What finally forced Germany to fix the gas system was not the Garand. It was the Soviet SVT-38 and SVT-40, met in large numbers in 1941. The Soviet rifle used a plain gas port cut into the barrel. The Germans took it apart, understood at once what they had forbidden themselves, and Walther grafted a Soviet-style gas system onto its own design. The result was the Gewehr 43. It went into production in October 1943 and was renamed the Karabiner 43 in April 1944. Total wartime production, 402,713. Now be fair to it, because this is where the audit gets interesting. On paper, the Gewehr 43 was the better rifle. 10 rounds against 8, in a detachable box magazine. It could be topped up at any time, which the American rifle could not, and reloaded lying flat behind cover, which is not a small thing. Germany, having taken the long way around, arrived at a design that solved the M1's most irritating limitation. And it changed nothing whatsoever. 400,000 rifles, delivered across the last 20 months of the war, into an army of millions, against an enemy that had already delivered 4 million. Springfield Armory alone, running at its January 1944 rate, would have matched Germany's entire wartime output of the Gewehr 43 in about 102 days. Then Germany did something more remarkable, and it is the closest thing this story has to a controlled experiment. They did not just catch up, they jumped a generation. German designers had studied their own combat data and concluded that most infantry fighting happens well inside 400 meters, which made the full power cartridge every army used wasteful of brass, powder, and logistics. So they built a shorter intermediate cartridge and a select fire weapon around it, delivering aimed single shots at range and automatic fire up close from one pair of hands. That was the Sturmgewehr 44, ancestor of essentially every service rifle carried today. It was so contentious inside the German war economy that it was first disguised in its designation as a machine pistol. About 425,000 were built, and Allied officers who examined captured examples concluded, correctly, that the future belonged to it. Meanwhile, the United States Army's own Battle Experiences Bulletin of January 11, 1945, recorded a blunter verdict from the field. It reported that the new German automatic carbine, met during the recent counteroffensive, had proved no match for the M1 rifle, producing a great deal of noise and not much accuracy or range. The man credited with that opinion was a sergeant of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, which is to say a man who had just spent the Ardennes on the receiving end of it. On the pure merits of the two weapons that judgment is almost certainly wrong, and that is why it matters. He was not describing which weapon was better engineered, he was describing what kept happening in firefights. Germany had invented the future of the infantry rifle, and still could not win, because the firefight was decided by how many trained men with full bandoliers were in the holes, and by whether more ammunition arrived tomorrow. They adapted brilliantly, twice, and it did not save them. And since we are auditing wrong answers, the Americans deserve one too, because they built a myth about this rifle that has outlived every fact in this video. The empty clip ejects from an M1 with a clear metallic ring. The legend says German and Japanese soldiers listened for that sound, knew the American was empty, and rushed him. The counter-legend, equally popular, says clever Americans threw spare clips onto rocks to bait the enemy into standing up. There is no documented case of either. Chase the story to its source and it is always a relative, or a friend of a friend, told decades later, and for every veteran who reports it, another reports the opposite. The mechanics work against it. The clip ejects after the last round has already gone. A fresh one goes in within seconds. The noise of a firefight is overwhelming, and no rifleman fought alone. What is true, and more interesting, is that many men believed it and changed their behavior accordingly. The fear was real. The casualties are not in the record. Both sides built a legend around 6 inches of stamped steel, and neither legend touched what actually decided the matter. One more irony before we close. The firm that could not produce a working self-loader for Germany was Mauser. The same Mauser that America had been paying 75 cents a rifle at the start of this story. 40 years after collecting that money for teaching the United States how to build a bolt-action, it could not follow where its pupil had gone, and the reason was not talent. One request before the last section, and it is the reason this channel exists. If your father, grandfather, or uncle carried an M1, worked at Springfield Armory or Winchester, or served in any of the units in this story, I would count it a privilege to read about them in the comments. What did he say about the rifle? What did he refuse to say about anything else? Those details do not exist in archives. They exist in families, and they disappear the moment we stop asking. Because there is one last scene, and it takes place in Germany, 11 years after the last shot. The Bundeswehr, the army of the new West German Republic, was established in 1955, a brand new force needing rifles immediately, with no domestic production to draw on, took its initial weapons from American stocks. The first standard rifle of the German army after the Second World War was the M1 Garand, alongside M1 and M2 carbines, Browning automatic rifles, and Thompson submachine guns. In July 1956, 9,572 border police officials transferred into the Bundeswehr, and they brought their own equipment with them, which was old Wehrmacht stock, about 9,000 Karabiner, 98K rifles, and more than 900 MG-42 machine guns. So for a period in the mid-1950s, in the same German armories, on the same racks, sat the bolt action that had lost the argument and the self-loader that had won it. Germany bought the Belgian FN rifle as the G1 in 1956 and adopted the G3 in 1959, and the American rifles went away. But the first weapon carried by a soldier of the new German army was the one his predecessors had spent 7 years failing to answer. Sit with that, because it decodes the case. Germany never lacked the design. By 1944 it had a better rifle than the American one, and a weapon, a generation beyond both. What it lacked cannot be drawn on a blueprint. So let us close the audit and answer the title directly. The rifle never stopped because a rifle is not an object. It is a rate of supply with a trigger on the end of it. It never stopped because of a decision in 1932 to keep an old cartridge, and therefore an entire existing industrial system, an arsenal that had been making guns for 142 years, a machinist who tooled the production line himself and took a salary instead of a royalty, and a supply chain that assumed the ordinary rifleman deserved to be fed as generously as the machine gun. The German infantryman was right about what he was hearing, and wrong about what it meant. He thought he was up against a weapon. He was up against a decision about who matters in an infantry squad. And from the bottom of a bare slope, that decision does not look like industry or doctrine. It looks like numbers. It looks like there being more of them than there are supposed to be. Every attacker in history has read enemy strength by volume of fire, because it is the only evidence available to a man who cannot see the holes. 18 riflemen firing continuously sound like a company. The German officer who reported a company was not exaggerating and was not a coward. He was using the only instrument he had, and it had been quietly recalibrated by a country he had never seen. Set the two ledgers side by side, and the ratio does the arguing. For every German self-loading rifle of any type that reached the front, America put roughly 10 M1s into the hands of infantry. Germany's answer arrived in the last 20 months of a 6-year war. America's had been in production since before the war began, and the rifle did not stop when the shooting did. Production ran until 1957, finishing at about 5,400,000, and hundreds of thousands went abroad as aid to South Korea, Italy, Japan, Greece, Turkey, and the Philippines. Germany did not fail to build a better rifle. It built 2 of them. A better rifle in small numbers is a museum exhibit. A good rifle in every pair of hands is a doctrine, and doctrine is what shoots back. As for the people in this story, they went home and mostly disappeared, the way that generation did. Melvin Johnson never got his rifle adopted as standard. The Netherlands Purchasing Commission bought it for colonies Japan then overran, and the rifles were diverted to Marine parachute battalions, who carried them in the Solomons. His light machine gun armed the first special service force in the Aleutians and Italy. Not the career he wanted, and not nothing. Lyle Book came home from a German prison camp, went to chiropractic school, and practiced in Missouri for decades. For 37 years, the army did nothing about what his platoon had done on that ridge. He spent years pushing for recognition and made a point of saying he wanted nothing for himself. On October 26, 1981, the platoon received a Presidential Unit Citation, 4 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars with Valor Device for the rest. 14 of the 18 were alive to stand there for it. It remains the most decorated American platoon for a single action of the war. Bauk lived until December 2016. William Tsakanikas, shot through the face on that slope, spent the rest of his life under reconstructive surgery. He changed his name to William James. He died in June 1977 of complications following his 37th operation, 32 years after the war ended and 4 years before anyone gave his platoon a medal. And John Garand stayed at Springfield Armory until he retired in 1953, working at the end on a bullpup rifle called the T-31 that he never finished. It was scrapped and sent to the museum in 1961. A bill to pay him $100,000 did not pass. He received the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1941 and one of the first medals for merit in 1944, and that was the whole of it. He died in Springfield, Massachusetts on February 16, 1974, aged 86. The armory itself had closed 6 years earlier, after 174 years. The rifle that replaced the M1 was the M14, essentially the same weapon with a detachable magazine, and the rifle that replaced that one owed its concept to the German weapon that lost. The mechanical inheritance is tangled, as it always is. The inheritance that matters is not mechanical. Every army in the developed world now arms its ordinary infantryman as though he is the point of the formation rather than the servant of a machine, and expects to supply him accordingly. That premise was not obvious in 1936. It was expensive, contested, and very nearly voted down. If this gave you something you had not considered, the like button helps it reach people who care about getting the history right rather than the version that fits on a poster. Subscribe if you want the next case. And remember what this one actually proves. The German soldier on that slope heard the truth perfectly. He simply had no category for it, because what he was hearing was not a rifle. It was a country's decision about the value of one man in a whole, made 12 years earlier by people whose names he would never learn. Garand, Campbell, Hatcher, Johnson, Van Orden, Edson, Bauck, Tsakanikas. They were not statistics in a production ledger. They had names, and they are the reason the sound never stopped.